Welcome to the Raised a Rebel podcast. My name is Katie Fruits, and this is my dad, Russell. Today we're going to be going over the First Amendment. So we'll start by just reading the text straight up from the amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting on establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
So, pretty short statement, but there is a lot in there.
For sure.
Almost every word in every sentence, and I would expand this to say of all the Bill of Rights, has been so studied and so debated. It's kind of fun to get into it because we talked in our last podcast. We started with the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, talked about where they brought us to. But I just wanted to throw out there that the Bill of Rights was passed almost immediately after the Constitution was ratified. And a little bit of the history behind it. It started in the Senate as 17 articles. The House passed 12, and then 10 of those were ratified. So at some point we can even get into, if we want to talk about the stuff in history that didn't make
that would
the
be
cut.
Interesting.
But for a group to say, hey, we just passed this landmark constitution, we're a founding of a new country, we set all this in place, oh, by the way, immediately here's our first round of changes. And I love that aspect that there was a lot of conflict at the time, and Madison felt that the powers of the Constitution were strong enough to restrict the government that a Bill of Rights wasn't needed. And there were other politicians, absolutely not. They refused to ratify the Constitution unless there was a Bill of Rights. So even though it was ratified, this is still up in the air. These 10 articles, these 10 bills that come forward to essentially orchestrate a shield of personal rights and liberties from the government and around the Constitution. So that's kind of where we're starting on this.
Right. One thing I think is interesting about that is you said that Madison strongly opposed it because he felt like it was already protected well enough in the Constitution. Do you know, like, how much how much was he actively against it? Because to me, I imagine he'd be like, well, they're all good things. I suppose a little extra protection wouldn't hurt. But do you know how that actually played out?
I don't, there's not a lot of written debate between them that I've seen. I'm sure there could be some out there. Again, we're not constitutional scholars, but I just know in the stuff that I've read in the past and my understanding, the History Channel version of it was that Madison was opposed because he felt like the Constitution was strong enough on its own. So before we started, I said there's 5 components that are spelled out here. The first being, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to petition. And I know that differs a little bit from the text in there. But if I was to walk up to anybody on the street and they said, hey, pop quiz, what is the First Amendment? Those are the 5 points that I would make.
If they know that much.
I'm assuming.
I feel like a lot of people tend to boil it down to just, it's the free speech amendment.
It's the free speech or the religion.
Yeah.
Because I see a lot of that. And people don't identify it as such, but they look at it of, oh, you're invalidating freedom from religion, freedom of religion, and they don't understand what that means. And I think we could have a whole podcast just on freedom of religion. But let's get into it. So key freedoms guaranteed. In religion, it prohibits the government from establishing an official religion. It protects an individual's right to worship as they choose. So we talk about that as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Now, that does not say freedom from religion, as a lot of people would like to do this. It is saying that the state will not create or endorse a specific religion and will not force anybody to be a member of that religion. And that's pretty much where it ends.
Well, a thing to keep in mind with all of these 5 points, and it really applies to all of the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights as a whole. These are not laws that are restricting what a person can do. It's restricting what the government can do.
And I think that's a really good point. This is a framework to say this is what the government cannot infringe upon. It's to protect the individual liberty. And so, when we look at that, it prohibits the government from establishing. It prohibits, it bans it. And you'll see this repeated as a theme as we go through this. It is directed at the government. And I think a lot of times people like to flip that around.
Right. For sure. Like to say, you see it all the time. For example, let's say somebody says something and I say, you shouldn't be able to say that. That's wrong. That's mean, whatever. And they go, well, it's my freedom of speech.
Oh, and
right?
We'll get into that.
And I'm infringing on that. We will. But just to point out, these truly do reflect. It's like, the government holding a gun to its own head, saying we can't, these are not laws that are put on the people. It's put on the government to protect the people from the government.
We've talked about in previous podcasts about Christian nationalism and other kinds of nationalism type movements. And this essentially says that, the government cannot predicate or dictate what religion people follows. It can't make laws regarding that. And people have a hard time with that.
Yeah.
People really do. They want the government to come in and say, the government says you can't involve religion in the government. It doesn't say that at all.
Yeah.
In fact, it says entirely the opposite. Religion can be in government. We see this like, you can't talk about religion at the office, right? A government, you can't. I'm going to throw an example out there, and it's a bad example, and I know it going into it, but you can't wear like a Christian T-shirt if you're the post office, right? And why not? That's not the establishment of an official religion.
Right.
It's not the government coming in and saying, you can't exercise your religion.
Right. Well, and I think another way that tends to get muddled is when it's a big corporation or business, right? Or social media. That's technically not the government, right? But they still enforce censorship.
So let's get into that. You keep wanting to go into free speech and not religion.
I think they're both very big points. I feel like for me, when I think of the First Amendment, I tend to jump to freedom of speech.
I think most people do, but I think we're overlooking that religion component. And I think it's tied into the DNA of all of the Bill of Rights. Okay, so freedom of speech protects various forms of expression, including political speech, artistic expression, which is a huge one, we'll get into that, and symbolic acts. So now pick up your political speech. That one's pretty easy to understand, right? Artistic expression gets into it. Now, in the 60s, maybe 70s, there was a lot of issues with the debate around public pornography, public nudity, and people were saying, well, it's artistic. It's protected under artistic speech. And there's a ton of stuff.
Right.
That's the very first thing. If something is deemed vulgar or against some type of local ordinance, artistic is how they argue it. So what do you think of that?
So I feel like this has been clarified through a multitude of Supreme Court cases.
Okay.
So basically, when we look at judicial precedent, there is a category of cases that supports the Supreme Court ruling on the side of individual liberties, right? You have the right to say and do what you want. And then there's the other side of it that errs on the side of keeping the peace. And it's in this little sweet spot in the middle that we try and reside when we're talking about our First Amendment rights, right? And so it was the case that set the precedent for the Brandenburg Rule,
Okay.
which basically says that the intent to harm is part of what's taken into account in this free speech. So the example I think of is, let's say that a gathering is happening and whatever it's for you disagree with, so you make a big post or about how bad it is, and you're saying, you shouldn't be supporting this, blah, 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 right? That is protected. Now, to go to the event and shout, there's a fire, to make everyone leave, has harmful intent, right? And this also came into play with a case before this where, I'm trying to remember his name. He was basically against the draft, right? And they had just established the rule that basically said, or the law that was like, you can't interfere or do anything against the draft, I guess. That's not how it's put. I'm trying to remember the name of it because
my thought always goes to the one, and I think you said it was in Iowa, but the Supreme Court case about people protesting in schools, right? And the black armbands for people that were protesting the draft. And they said that's constitutional. You can't throw the kids out of school and suspend them for what they would consider
and that's symbolic speech, right?
Would it be though? I would say political speech. Because what's your outcome? Your outcome is a political...
Right. The reason it's symbolic, though, is because it's an action, not words being said. So it's...
Yeah, I'd still say political because you could, it's the idea of like doing political graffiti, right? It's still graffiti.
But graffiti's also...
It can be artistic. It can also be...
Right.
So that's why I say the stuff in this First Amendment, maybe the Second Amendment, it's a close tie,
right,
have probably been debated and discussed more than anything else that we're going to go over. But the symbolic acts, artistic expression, it's a big one. Everybody, the one I go to under, we'll get into press, it kind of goes between the two, is the First Amendment auditors. Have you ever seen these guys?
I don't think so. So
they go out on the street corner with a camera on a public place, and they'll just start recording stuff, right? And sometimes they have a political point they're trying to make. So they'll go outside of, to use a good example, maybe there's a lawyer that settled on a case that they really disagree with. So they're going to stand outside their law office on public property and just record. And people get really mad and come up and say, oh, you can't record. Yes, I can. I'm in a public place. And if you go onto YouTube, there's thousands of these videos, right? And the whole entire point is it's a protected action. You're in a public place, depending on the laws, you can publicly record, and people get really mad. Well, I don't want my picture recorded. Well, you're in a public place. Freedom of speech, First Amendment comes into play. And usually these videos end up with like somebody getting assaulted, somebody getting arrested. A lot of times it's the person filming getting arrested because somebody's called the cops on them. And I think the entire point of that is to look at First Amendment situations that make people really uncomfortable. Legally, they're in the right. The police are, sometimes put in the middle, but it comes down to that discussion of what's allowed.
Again, it comes down, part of it is your intent to harm? Is if you're actively just trying to get people worked up to do something, that's not protected. And that's what happened in the Brandenburg case, is it was a leader of the Ku Klux Klan, right? And he came out, he had invited the press to come and record his event, whatever. And he had this whole big racial slur, basically talking about how the government needs to protect the rights of white people over all of it. The kind of ridiculous stuff that happened from the KKK that we all know is bad, so I don't even need to dig into that because it's just everyone knows it was not good. But anyways, what ended up coming into play was his speech freedom of speech or not? And they ruled that it was not protected speech because it was being said with the intent to compel others to action against these people, right?
Okay.
He's not just saying the government should or shouldn't do this or that. He is actively trying to call people to action, really to harm others. And so that sort of speech is rarely ever protected, right?
Okay.
Me saying you should go do this to someone else that will be harmful. But actually, I think that's how it went. I could be mixing up cases. I researched too many different cases all at once that some of them got mumbled in my head. So if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. But I know the Brandenburg case was what set the precedent for the Brandenburg Rule, which is the one that deals with the intent to harm.
Okay, so let's move on to freedom of the press. So ensures freedom from censorship for news and information. And this one's interesting to me because we always hear that, a free press is essential to having a free country because it's a press that isn't put under the scrutiny of the government. But we've seen in recent years, and I'll even throw the current administration under the bus, there's a lot of manipulation of the press. While there's freedom of the press, there's a lot of favoritism that goes on and a lot of straight out manipulation. And
there's not many
truly independent press corps anymore.
If you're in the press, it's very hard to it's hard to be a truly nonpartisan,
yes,
side of the press. Everyone always leans one way or the other, which is why they have the freedom of press. So even if they are on that disagreeing side from the current administration or the current
they're protected.
movement, they are still
Now,
protected.
there are some limitations. We'll get into some limitations and applications later. Limitations on this one that comes to mind is the clear and present danger rule, especially when it comes to government information. The government can censor and keep the press out of things that provide, and the quote is, a clear and present danger. So this isn't necessarily something that, 20 years from now they're concerned about it happening. And we see this come up with Freedom of Information Act requests. We'll talk about the Kennedy assassination. Why is the Kennedy assassination papers still redacted and still secret? Right? So theoretically, the argument here is it's a clear and present danger to the United States. And that's an example. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because we'll be here all afternoon.
Yeah, for sure. Just to give a little background, if anyone is interested in researching it more, the clear and present danger rule was established by precedent by the Schenck v. United States case, which is the one I was referring to, where he opposed the draft.
Okay. Yeah, and there's information on that one. So freedom of the press, freedom of assembly guarantees the right to gather peacefully. Another hotly debated one because...
No king's protest?
Yeah. Well, because now you have jurisdictions that say, well, you have to get a permit. Mm-hmm. There's areas that for the safety of the people, for the protection of the environment,
right,
whatever, you have to pull a permit. Well, at what point does refusing a permit become a violation of freedom to assemble? So I think there's some debate in here. We see this would you want a giant 1,000-person protest in the middle of a national park that has a sensitive environment? No, probably not. But if you refuse a permit for a conservative group on the Capitol steps, but then the next weekend approve a liberal, where's the favoritism here and where is the correction factor? Who do you go to whoever issues the permit, say that isn't right. How do you enforce that? What's your justification? Is there a clear reason why one was approved and the other one wasn't?
I think that's a hard situation because obviously it's illegal for a government organization to deny you the right to gather because of political beliefs or, whatever other reason. But I think it's an easy thing to blame on something that is more of a, I'm going to say, objective kind of good and evil thing. Like you said, a delicate environment, nature-wise, like in a national park. You wouldn't necessarily want a giant gathering, say, in Yellowstone National Park where they have geysers going off in unstable ground because of thermal.
So here's a more realistic one for you. It doesn't say that it has to be political. It just says gather. So, you're 18. There's cities that have curfews for under 21.
Yeah.
Even under 18. So how does that affect?
It's a good question. I don't know.
If you're private property, you can say, hey, this is private property. I'd ask you to leave, or I can trespass you. That's an understand. That's a legal concept. But if it's a public place, you're in the city park, you're a group of 18-year-olds, and there's a curfew. Do you have a case for a lawsuit there on First Amendment rights?
I don't know. I'd have to look into it. I haven't really dug into the whole right to gather thing as much.
Okay, so we'll move on to the final one. I think this is probably the least seen, is the right to petition. And petition can be defined as a couple different ways. It can be like through public ballot measure. We've seen states that you can put forth a motion. You'll see it. You can do it at a county commissioner meeting. You can do it at a state level. You can do it at a national level. But to put forth a motion or a movement or a petition, it depends on what jurisdiction you're at, whether it's a legal proceeding or a jurisprudence. There's all different flavors of it. But the idea is that the government cannot restrict a mechanism of public feedback into the government.
Right. And when I worked in constituent services, that kind of came up a lot. So it's definitely something that I feel like is prevalent, but only if you have the courage to talk to the government, because I feel like it's not on a lot of people's minds, because a lot of people wouldn't even think to petition to the government or to their elected officials. So
that's a good question. So with your work as constituent services, when somebody would call in and want to voice their frustration, their concern, whatever, would you consider that a petition? Or are you like a petition something more formal where they're trying to actually enact change versus voice an opinion?
I think both are protected. And I don't know if it kind of spills over into a freedom of speech thing versus a petition. But how it says it in the text of the amendment is petition the government for a redress of grievances. Because, I think we would agree that the First Amendment encompasses the right to protest, right? And so at what point, are you protesting? And I also think that to comment to your elected officials is partially your right, as they are your representatives.
So we've heard that before. So I had a friend in Colorado who was banned on a Facebook page from her elected official.
Oh, interesting.
And they'd gotten into it. They were friends. They got into a beef. It was over a Second Amendment issue, and he blocked her. And she said, you can't do that. It's First Amendment. Because you're my elected official, you cannot keep me from...
But do you think there's a line where once you've crossed it, it's now a safety issue?
No, this wasn't.
This wasn't?
No.
Okay.
This was a difference of opinion. There were no threats. There were nothing like that. So that's a good point, though, because if somebody makes a threat,
right,
then you've kind of crossed that line. But if you have a disagreement with a constituent, it's one thing to this person's halfway across the country from me. I have no connection to them. But when you're a constituent to that elected official and they block that method, now we're talking. Now we're into some murky areas.
Yeah.
So let's get into the limitations and protections. And I've got just a couple notes on there. But government action, it restricts government actions, not private entities or individuals. Right. So again, we talk about this is focused on the government. And some of the examples that we sometimes stray into is a person protesting or saying something. It doesn't necessarily protect them. It protects the government from enacting laws or regulations that impact that activity.
Yes, it prevents, not protects the government. It protects the person.
Protects the person, prevents the government. They are not absolute. Speech, and we've talked about this, can be restricted if it incites violence, defames someone, is obscene, and we could have a whole podcast on what the definition of obscene is,
Well,
or
and
presents
whole
the clear and present day
defamation
sure.
thing, that comes into play with organizations and businesses a lot too.
Yep. Symbolic speech, actions like protests or wearing armbands can be protected as symbolic speech. So, and how it applies to states, although it originally targeted Congress, the Supreme Court has applied these protections to state government via due process of the 14th Amendment. So it's complicated. I think you're right. If you walked up to somebody on the street and you asked what the First Amendment was, they would say freedom of speech. But there's a lot more in there. And especially for somebody like you that is interested in government policy and a future in politics and representing the government, I think there's a lot of lessons that can be found in here too.
For sure. I do think the one of the 5 main points that are protected that stands out to me is I feel like freedom of religion doesn't fit in with the others as much. You know, the others are all regarding what you say, what you do, whereas religion is what you believe, right? And I think that's just an interesting contrast. And to put it in perspective a little bit, I'm reading right now a book called Gulag Archipelago. I always say it wrong.
Those Russian writers.
I have practiced saying it, and I still mess it up. And part of what it was talking about that I thought was so interesting is it talked about how you had freedom of religion, right? You can believe what you want because they can't control your own thoughts. But it was a crime to teach your children about your religion. It was a crime to participate in actions relating to your religion, and it was a crime to attempt to spread your religion, which if you're a Christian, all of those things are kind of like a core of it. But they did make the point, nothing the government does can control what you think and what you believe.
I think we've seen this in some foreign countries that have been extremely strict on religion. So, throw China out there as an example. There's people that sneak Bibles into China. They cannot control what you believe, but they can absolutely control your public action.
And control all of the fruits of your inner belief.
And the tools. They can ban Bibles, they can ban worship, they can go through and say, you can't do these things, but they can't control what you believe. And I think this, along that same line, I think they wanted to protect the practicing of religion, not just the belief of. And I think that's where they put that restriction on the government is you can't endorse a state religion, you can't, prescribe a religion, but it's a restriction on the government so that you have the freedom to practice and do those outward things that define you as a Christian.
Right. Which also comes into play when you talk, separation of church and state, which again is, a lot of people think church and state, or separation of church and state means your religion shouldn't influence your policy making if you're in the government. But really, it's the opposite, right? So if you're a Christian, by all means, your faith and your morals are what are contributing to your decision making, right? Because it's the foundation of your beliefs. But where the separation of church and state is saying that the government cannot interfere in the church. The church can interfere in the government, but government can't interfere with church.
That's it. That's First Amendment. There's a lot of stuff packed in just a few sentences. Yeah, and I think if you haven't realized already, it's very nuanced. What is, what isn't protected, and it would take a lot of... You say nuance, but wait till we get into the Second Amendment, where there's one word in the whole amendment that has probably been debated more, well, maybe 3 words, but one word than probably anything else in the entire Constitution. For sure. Well, with that, thank you guys for
listening to our podcast today, and we hope you'll tune in next time when we can cover the nuance of the Second Amendment.
Thanks.